Welcome back everybody to Maple Syrup Tech. I'm Rick, and today we're going to discuss an issue that I find that's pretty important. It's a message we need to send to the GPU manufacturers of the practices and the things we would like to change about the GPU market. Now don't worry, this is not another rant about mining. Everyone's done that issue to death, and we know that mining is a problem for GPU pricing, but that's really not on the manufacturers, that's really on the demand. You can't, in my opinion, you can't blame them for selling their products at a premium, although it is unfair to gamers. But like I said, we're not going to get into that issue. We're really going to focus on the practices that AMD and NVIDIA have done in the past that really shouldn't be repeated in any future generations of GPUs to really help grow the DIY PC market, and also to be fair with the consumers and not require consumers to become product specialists to be able to make sure that they're not getting, sorry for the lack of a better word, but not getting screwed on their purchases for GPUs. So without further ado, let's look at the first issue. So the first issue is unnecessary memory configurations. The company that's most, guilty of this, as we could say, is AMD. Unfortunately, every single one of their cards come in two different memory configurations. You have the RX 550 2GB, RX 550 4GB, you have the RX 550 2GB, 4GB, and so forth. It's really unnecessary memory configurations, and it adds unnecessary complexity to the choice of GPUs, which will just confuse, a new builder or someone who doesn't want to spend 2 or 3 hours looking over different, reviews on the cards to see exactly which games are impacted by the memory difference, and if there actually is a difference in performance between the different cards. And the worst example of this is the RX 550, in my opinion, where in most games you're not even going to see a difference between 2 and 4GB, simply because the GPU itself is so underpowered. It can't really, use the full 4GB even when it has it on the PCB. NVIDIA only does it right now for the GTX 1060, but that's a different issue, and it's actually going to come up in our second point. So the first point that I would really like the GPU market to change is for AMD to choose a memory configuration for each card and just stick with it. The price difference isn't important enough, and it just creates rarity at the higher memory models, meaning that, for example, an RX 570 8GB goes for more expensive than it should, simply because so many more people want the 8GB version versus the 4GB version. Retailers stay stuck with the 4GB version, so they put up the price on the 8GB ones to push out the 4GB. And this is even when there isn't the whole mining issue. So, first issue is stop with the unnecessary memory configurations. Now, let's move on to point number 2. The second point I want to look at is confusing and misleading branding. For example, the GTX 1060, which I discussed a few seconds ago. It is unfair of NVIDIA to call the GTX 1060 3GB and 6GB by the same name, because you're not only getting a different memory configuration, you're actually getting a whole different GPU between the 3 and 6GB variant, because the 3GB variant not only has lesser GDDR5 memory, it also has fewer CUDA cores, meaning in essence it's a whole different GPU. And this is very misleading, especially for someone just getting into DIY PC building and thinking that he has the choice between these two cards, and that in the end he would be getting the same gaming performance approximately, minus a little bit less, VRAM. So basically, honestly, this by NVIDIA has to stop, especially how it's even more confusing because NVIDIA already has the whole, 1050 Ti gradation in their system. Theoretically, NVIDIA should have called the GTX 1060 3GB the GTX 1060 and the GTX 1060 6GB the GTX 1060 Ti. Now I know all of you out there are going to tell me that yes, but the 6GB came out first, so you couldn't call the 3GB the Ti and you didn't want to change the name. I agree with you, but you can't tell me that they don't plan their launches way ahead of time, and production of these type of graphics cards takes months, meaning that if you were really going to pop out a 1060 3GB and cut the CUDA cores, Look, I don't care, call it a GTX 1055. Just don't call it a GTX 1060 if it isn't just a different memory configuration that you're offering. This is unfair to consumers that don't take the time to spend 1 or 2 hours a day keeping up in tech news. And like I said, to the DIY PC builder just getting into it, he's not going to necessarily take the time to check the numbers of CUDA cores on each model. He's just going to assume, with the same name, I should be getting the same GPU. So that is my point number 2. And the last point that we're going to get to in a couple of seconds, in my opinion, is the most important one. And this applies to both NVIDIA and AMD. Let's get to it right now. Now, the third point that I wanted to get to is, in my opinion, the most important one. And that is changing the specs of a card mid-cycle without changing its name. Now, both NVIDIA and AMD have been responsible for this in the past year. The example for AMD would be the RX 560. If you guys don't know, there are 2 versions of the RX 560 out on the market, both called the exact same thing. The only thing is some have 16 CUDA cores and some have 14 CUDA cores. Now, AMD probably did this because they weren't getting the returns on the returns on the wafers that they were expecting, and they needed to put out 14 model CUDA cores to basically get rid of their back stock. I understand that. Just don't call it an RX 560, especially when it has the exact specs of the previous RX 460. Same example as for when we talked about NVIDIA. You can just call it anything else. I don't care, the RX 555, anything. You shouldn't have to go into a card description and hope that the retailer says how many CUDA cores is included in the model you're looking for to be able to decide if you want to buy a card. If I want to go on Newegg and pop up a list of the RX 560s, I don't want to have to go into each individual description to see if it's a 14 or 16 CUDA core version. And that is not okay by AMD, especially because if you're going to do something like that, make a press release at least. Like I said, to begin with, it just shouldn't have the same name, but if you were going to insist on keeping it in the same name, make a press release, let people know that that a new version is coming out. Don't let it come out by someone buying one and letting it out in the media, as pretty much it happened, and then after that going to your website and changing that the configuration could have 14 or 16 CUDA cores. It just doesn't make sense. And NVIDIA hasn't been any better this year. The best example in the past month would be the GT 1030, which all of a sudden they decided to stop including GDDR5 memory on it and include regular DRAM memory. So basically DDR4 memory instead, which, if you guys don't know, is a lot slower memory and does have a significant impact on performance. So you're really not getting the same card anymore today as you were back when it was GDDR5. Now, it's not all manufacturers, it's not all cards, but once again, same thing as AMD. Do not call the card the same thing if it does not have the same basic specs. If you release the card with GDDR5, have it have GDDR5 throughout its whole life cycle. If you decide to choose it, call the card something else. It could be as easy as putting a letter at the end, the GT 1030R, for example, just so that the person knows that when they're buying the card, there is just in the name some type of difference between the card previously. Now, honestly, this is the worst because it really misleads clients and it really misleads people, because you can look up a review for an RX 560, go to a website, buy an RX 560, and then when you get it at home realize, hey, it's not the same thing I checked up online. How come? To me it said RX 560, I checked the review, it should be the same thing. And as a lot of other YouTubers had mentioned, it makes people doubt the testing we do on the other end. Because we come out with numbers, and then the numbers aren't good anymore halfway down the road. Anyway, I hope this video has helped you guys, and maybe if you guys weren't aware that these type of things were happening, I hope it made you aware, and if you're going out to buy a GPU, you will check for the moment into these things. But the real bigger message I would want to send is that it's time for AMD and NVIDIA to stop doing these type of things And I know that because we're in a duopoly where there's only two manufacturers for the moment, they can sort of allow themselves to do this because each one is sort of as guilty as the other, but it just doesn't make it right in my opinion. Now there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Intel might be getting into the GPU market, meaning that there will be added competition and it will be harder to do these type of things. And it's not all doom and gloom because it's not all abuse from the GPU manufacturers. On the other hand, let's end with a positive note. I do have to mention that the last generation of cards is one of the biggest increases from one generation to the other in performance that we've seen in a while. So at the same time, at least we're getting products that are having a bigger impact from one generation to the other than before, especially with the Pascal 10 series. It was a serious improvement over the 9 series. So, I hope that you liked the video. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel a lot. And as usual, I'll see you guys in my next video.